Welcome to the Fantasy Baseball Beat. Thank you for joining us today. We got a good one for you, folks. We are joined by Nathan Ruiz, reporter for the Baltimore Sun. But first, let me introduce my co host, Mike Carter. Mike, how are you today?
How are you guys doing? I'm doing great. Thanksgiving was nice. Back to school this week. Not that I'm counting the days, but we have 15 days until Christmas break comes up. So,
Not that you're counting, man. I am so jealous of that school schedule, man. That was my goal at first, not because I really wanted to work in a school, but I wanted a job there just for the schedule. Uh, can't beat that.
no, I'm not gonna lie to you. It's not bad actually. We get more time off than any profession that I know of, honestly. Now, granted, we do a lot of work, but it's also a really nice schedule, and it's very family friendly, especially when you've got kids that you got to do childcare for, like I do. So.
Absolutely. Well, I didn't end up working in a school. Another aspiration of mine at one point in my life was to be a sports reporter, and that didn't pan out either. But we do have a sports reporter on the podcast with us. Like I said, we've got Nathan Ruiz of the Baltimore Sun. You could follow him on Twitter at Nathan S. Ruiz. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Doing well, guys. Thanks for having me.
All right. So before we get into the nitty gritty of the Orioles and trying to find out more about what their offseason is going to look like, I want to ask a little bit about you. So, Nathan, I wanted to ask you just a little bit about your career path. How long have you been on the Orioles beat, and what does your career path look like?
Yeah, so this upcoming season will be my fifth on the Orioles beat. So I came in before the 2019 season, really like just at the tail end of spring training. I started at the Sun, and so I've basically only known the rebuild. Starting in 2019, that was Brandon Hyde's first year, Mike Elias's first year.
Hmm.
I fortunately missed 2018, but my running joke entering this season was that I was probably like by winning percentage of losing as beat writer in America, just covering the 2019 to 21 Orioles. So I grew up in Nevada. I played baseball, loved baseball, but I recognized pretty early like it wasn't going to be a long term thing for me. But like I said, loved the game, wanted to find a way to stick around it. I don't really remember signing up for it, but I was in my high school journalism class as an elective and fell in love with that too. And so it kind of just clicked in my brain of putting those two things together. Ended up moving halfway across the country to go to Oklahoma State, study sports journalism there. Had a few internships along the way, and then ended up after a few months after graduating, after another internship at MLB.com, was back in Oklahoma covering Oklahoma State for the Oklahoman. And after a year there, I moved the other half across the country to Baltimore and have now, like I said, covered the Orioles for the past 4 years.
Very cool. Well, listen, you have something in your Twitter bio that is kind of a something else to be proud of here. I
Yeah,
see
this is a
here that
great
you
podcast
were,
talking point. Yeah, go for it.
yeah, you were a Mario Kart champion at Oklahoma State. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, basically every podcast I go on, they see that, and so I'm glad that we kept the streak going. But yeah, it was
That's right.
my freshman year. There was a video game tournament on campus, and I think it was the NCAA football, FIFA, and Mario Kart. And I like it. It sounds much cooler than it was. There was literally like 7 people who played Mario Kart. Most people, because there's tiered prizes. Like you got a better prize if you won the FIFA tournament. You got a better prize if you won the NCAA tournament. So I went to the Mario Kart tournament. It was just like on the Wii. And yeah, I think I only had to win like 3 or 4 races. They gave me the prize. I think it was a pair of headphones. And then I also got the bracket. Like they had this giant, I guess me doing hand signals doesn't really service you guys on a podcast too much, but um, it was a very large, like styrofoam bracket, like piece of styrofoam with a bracket on it. And there was, like I said, there's only 8 people in it. So it wasn't very filled out, but I did receive that. I think it's somewhere in my basement still, but yeah, that was a big the headphones did not last long. They broke pretty soon thereafter, but I hopefully still have that bracket. And I have the Twitter bio forever until
Yeah.
Elon,
No, you got to keep it
shuts that
there,
down.
man.
So, but
Yeah.
And so we know that you have your journalistic integrity because most people will probably lied about the number of people who were in the tournament, Nathan. So
right.
kudos
Well,
to
as
you.
far as I know, I beat every participant. So
That's
that's all
it.
that matters. I was the winner.
That's terrific.
So, bigger thrill, winning the tournament or getting the Orioles job?
Uh, well, this so I think in the moment I was really excited about the Mario Kart tournament, but in terms of life, I have them both in my bio and they're in the order they're in. It says Orioles
Right.
reporter and then Mario Kart champion. So maybe at some point in life I switch those, but for right now I think those are in the appropriate order.
Okay. All right. Makes sense. Well, listen, we are so happy to have you on. We're going to get into breaking down this Orioles team, what their offseason is going to look like, and then we'll put our fantasy baseball spin on it. But we want to start out with some highlights of the Orioles 2022 season, and there were quite a few unexpectedly. Right, this team was much better than most people thought they were going to be, and that was a big reason for that was these young prospects coming up. And we'll start off with Adley Rutschman, and he was the number one prospect. And he really seemed to make a difference when he came up. I know he struggled initially at first, but once it seemed that he got comfortable, he really took off. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the emergence of Adley Rutschman as a leader of this team.
Yeah, I mean, so he wasn't on the team for the first 40 games of the year, suffered a tricep injury in spring training. But the storyline of those whole 40 games was, when is Adley going to get here? When's he going to be healthy? When is the organization going to deem him ready? And so it was kind of not this like dark cloud, but it was just something that it was basically all people were talking about. The team wasn't playing particularly well, really having some struggles offensively. And they lose John Means to Tommy John surgery. Like, people just were begging for Adley to show up, and then it happens. And I just remember that first day when he came up against the Rays, there was just such a different energy in the ballpark. Like I had said, I started in 2019, so that first draft with Adley going number one overall, that was kind of my initiation. And since then, this has kind of been Adley's organization. He hasn't been on the team, but he's been the face of the franchise. He was the face of the rebuild, and so for that arrival to happen. I think it changed a lot of things. They lost that first game. They were 16-25 at that point, but had a couple rough weeks after that too. Adley did personally, so did the team. But then they, like you mentioned, when he took off, so did they. I think it was like a 2-month stretch where the only players who were better than him in Fangraphs wins above replacement were like Paul Goldschmidt, Nolan Arenado, and Aaron Judge. I think Shohei was on that list too. So it's a pretty impressive group that, he played at that level, and that speaks to what he was doing offensively and defensively. I think they were on like a 95-ish win pace in games he was their starting catcher. So, the hope is that he'll be their starting catcher more regularly next season, just in terms of actually being healthy for the full year and being there from opening day on. But, what he does offensively is a switch hitter, a guy who works counts. That's something the Orioles really lacked over the past 3 years, or the previous 3 years, was guys who could make pitchers work and get deep in counts and draw walks and get on base in a variety of ways. And you see that really in a lot of the prospects they brought up. Obviously, you see that in Gunnar Henderson. Kyle Stowers has some of that to his game. Taron Vavra is kind of an underrated guy, but he does the same thing. This is kind of just an organizational philosophy of getting guys who work counts, make pitchers work, get on base however they can. And Adley obviously best exemplifies that.
Oh, for sure. Can you talk a little bit, Nathan, about how many games you think he might get into this year behind the plate? I mean, I know that they don't really have any other catcher on the roster right now, do they?
No, well, so they have another guy on the 40 who they claimed off waivers from the Reds. So I think that situation is going to change over the course of this offseason. I think that's definitely a target area for them. It's Mark. I'm not certain if it's Mark Kovaleski. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but he's the only other catcher on their 40-man right now. And so, but yeah, so that they will add another catcher. You look at last season, they had Robinson Chirinos as kind of a veteran backup guy, and he struggled offensively and defensively, really. So I think if you can find someone who's a solution on one of those sides, you feel a lot more comfortable giving Adley more DH days, because I think they were kind of comfortable with the arrangement they had. They might push it more. I think if you look at in terms of his workload, he was catching pretty regularly. It's not that he was, there's 7 games a week, so to speak. If he's catching 4 to 3, I think it was more 5 to 2 more often than not. And he was in the lineup practically every day. If he wasn't catching, he was DHing. So I think he'll be in there a ton. I don't have an idea of an exact number, but I think you can expect him to be a pretty regular guy. Like, I don't think he'll be necessarily, given he's a guy who's so early in his career, hasn't necessarily earned or received that big contract yet. He's not going to be a JT Realmuto type, so to speak, but I think he will be someone who's behind the plate pretty regularly and is going to be in the lineup even when he's not.
Right. All right, yeah, and you mentioned Gunnar Henderson, who was another foundational piece here that the Orioles are going to be relying on moving forward. Can you tell us a little bit about what the impact that he had on the team last year, and what do you see as the outlook for him this season?
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to the state of the organization that, I talked about how in those first 40 games, everyone was like, "Where's Adley? Where's Adley?" It basically transitioned right after that to "Where's
Yeah.
Grayson? Where's Grayson Rodriguez?" And then once
Mhm.
Grayson got hurt, it was basically "Where's Gunnar?" Because Gunnar, was tearing it up in Double A Bowie to start the year, basically forced their hand to send him to Triple A, and then he kind of did the same thing. They still waited long enough to make sure he retains his rookie eligibility going into 2023, but he just played so impressively for a kid his age, basically, and he's 21 years old, drafted out of high school, was really young back in 2019, was their second round pick. And then he basically replaces Adley directly as the number one prospect, not only in the organization, but in baseball. So just a really impressive talent. I think one of the things that's most remarkable to me about him, and it kind of speaks to what he might be able to do in 2023. You look at him at the end of last season in 2021, he, starts the year in Delmarva, I believe, low A Delmarva, goes up to high A Aberdeen, and then spends most of the season there, has some struggles, and then he ends the season with a week or so in Double A Bowie, gets the opportunity to play for the Bay Sox in the playoffs, and he does okay. He's not necessarily tearing the cover off the ball. He has a bit of success, but then he's able to take that brief experience, carry that through his offseason, and then he just dominates in Bowie to start 2022, like I said, and so I think that speaks to kind of the person he is, the player he is, that growth mindset that he has to take this experience he had where he was really impressive. He came out
Mhm.
and really made an impact right out of the gate. Really played terrifically defensively, left side of the infield as well. So I think it speaks to what he can do in 2023 when you look at if he's able to build on his experience in the way he did last year from going from Bowie to Bowie. If he can do that going from Baltimore to Baltimore, it obviously will be tougher pitching. They'll adjust. But I think, he's a really impressive talent. And it's no wonder that, as people do way too early, rookie of the year rankings, that he's at the top of most of
Mm-hmm.
those lists.
Yeah, and he's a player that fantasy baseball players are, naturally they've fallen in love with. He's going in the top 100 of early drafts this year, and something we'll talk more about this, Mike, but something when I was looking at Gunner's profile is that his ground ball rate and his K rate are both, I guess, a little bit elevated for talking strictly from a fantasy angle. Like he has like a
Right.
60% ground ball rate, K rate is around 26%. But what I'm hearing from you, Nathan, is that this is someone who really has a growth mindset. So do you see like those areas that Gunner would be the type of player that he's going to attack that and look to improve in those areas?
Yeah. Just to give you guys like an example, he was someone who really struggled with the high fastball in
Okay.
2021, and then he spent a ton of time working to address that weakness. So I think he's a guy who, and this is again a big organizational thing, but you find your individual deficiency and you attack it. You work to improve at it. And I
Right.
think Gunner, when you look at him, Mike Elias, the Orioles GM, said this was still when Gunner was in Double A, but he said that he's kind of a flagpole for what they want to do organizationally in terms of develop. A second round pick out of a small school in Alabama, and then a couple years later, he's the number one prospect in baseball. So I think it speaks to both Gunner and the organization in terms of what they're able to do. So I don't want to make any promises about Gunner's fantasy draft stock, just given that he is going to be a player in his first major league season.
Sure.
Pitchers are going to learn from his stint in the majors and see how to attack him differently. But I also think he's the type of player, and he's shown he's the type of player who can take how they're attacking him and learn from it and counter attack, so to speak.
Okay. One last thing I wanted to follow up specifically on him and then also apply it to the team in general. How aggressive do you see him being on the base pass this year?
Yeah, I think especially when you look at the bigger bases and some of the other rule changes that are in place, I think he's a guy who can get up to 15 steals. Maybe he wasn't um, huge in that category when he came up at the end of the season. But I think the Orioles, in particular, are a big base running aggressiveness team. You've got Jorge Mateo, who led the league in steals. Cedric Mullins was one behind. So I think that's a big part of their game,
Hmm.
just given that they've had some struggles in stringing hits together historically. So I think if you're able to get an extra base here, an extra base there, that goes a long way. So I think that's definitely an aspect of his game. And as he gets, more adjusted, as the game changes, as we'll see this next year, I think that'll be a big part of it.
Nathan, one of the questions that I have about the whole situation with Gunnar is where's he going to play? I mean, I think outside of where you guys are at in Baltimore, out here in the Midwest, people are not really sure where he. I mean, obviously he fits into the equation as a star on the team, but do you see him as a shortstop? Do you see him more at third base? Where do you see them using him this year?
I think he'll definitely be on the left side of the infield. They did experiment a bit with him in AAA before calling him up at first base, at second base, but his future's at on the left side of the infield. I think he can be a plus shortstop and a plus third baseman. In terms of which of those spots exactly he plays at, I think there's a potential for him to spend enough time at both, to have eligibility at both for sure. I think it depends also on what the Orioles end up doing this offseason and how they kind of decide to handle some of those new rule changes. You look at Jorge Mateo as a great speed guy. Maybe he was, was fielding Bible Award winner at shortstop, best shortstop defensively in baseball. So he's a guy who I think you're happy to have there. Ramon Urias obviously was a Gold Glove third baseman. So the Orioles have two pretty talented other infielders, but they also now have a clear opening at second base. Maybe you put Mateo there, let him use his range there, put Gunnar at short, let Ramon stay at third. Maybe you just, find a second baseman in free agency. Let Jorge continue to do his thing at shortstop. You let Gunnar handle third and fill in when Jorge needs a day off. Maybe something else happens entirely, and they have got a pretty deep stockpile of young infield prospects, and I think it's possible they trade some of those guys as they looked at in other areas. But just speaking broadly, I think that there's enough flexibility within Gunnar and his game that if he needs to play second base, he could. But I think his home is definitely going to be on the left side of the infield long term.
It's really interesting because I don't think anybody outside of maybe where you guys are at thought that those guys were as good of players as they showed last year.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting mix. I think Ramon Urias showed a little bit of talent offensively in 2021. He wasn't great in terms of the advanced metrics because he was playing a lot of shortstop. He was playing a lot of second base, but they really let him have a home at third base this past season. He still moved around a little bit, but he really showed what he could do at third base. Deservedly won a Gold Glove. I think unexpectedly, just given that he didn't have the innings that some of the other guys did, but really impressive in more limited time. And then Mateo, I think, really surprised everyone. Obviously, you kind of could tell the package was there. And when he came over on waivers at the end of the 2021 season, he really made an impression on the Orioles and their staff. Just in terms of, again, the skill set, he was at one point the Yankees' number one prospect, ahead of Aaron Judge, ahead of Gary Sanchez. So there's a guy with some pedigree. He just hadn't necessarily gotten that extended playing time, that extended opportunity. You look at it before he came to Baltimore, he was a guy who was in San Diego and was kind of being used as a defensive replacement, a pinch hitter, a pinch runner, playing a lot of outfield. He hadn't really gotten to just be a shortstop, which is his natural position, which he had, grown up playing. And the Orioles said, "Hey, you're our shortstop. You're a guy. We're going to give you that opportunity." And it paid off in a lot of ways. Again, he was terrific defensively, led the league steals. The bat is definitely a big question. He had a stretch where he's pretty successful, but he also has had some pretty significant swing and miss and chase issues. So I think, if he's able to take another step forward and is able to be, if you're able to mix his defensive skill set with his base running skill set with a modest offensive approach, you've got a really, really good player. It's just a matter of, can he get to that modest point? And then Ramon, I think, offers a lot in terms of the bat. So I think they have some flexibility here in terms of if they were to sign another infielder, they could find space for both of those guys. And they both have got sets that would enable them to fit into a bench or a part-time role for sure.
Right. So we covered Adley, we covered Gunnar. Got to talk about Grayson. Obviously, one of the top pitching prospects in baseball. Tell us, what do you think are the chances that Grayson breaks camp with the team this year?
I mean, I think if he's healthy, I think they're pretty high. I don't think that he has much else to show in AAA. Yeah. Mike Elias was pretty direct at the end of the season. He hopes he's in the rotation, and he thinks there's a very high likelihood of that. And so I think there's the added benefit now of, and this kind of applies to the situation with what they did with Gunnar and waiting to call him up when they did, of the extra draft pick for the team that, if a team has a top prospect on their opening day roster and that player wins Rookie of the Year, that team gets an extra draft pick. So I think there's incentive now for teams. Mm-hmm. There's a big question coming into this season: how would the Orioles handle Adley? And then it was rendered moot pretty quick when he hurts his tricep. So we didn't really necessarily get to see what is the Orioles' philosophy on this new rule. Do they still try to effectively manipulate the player's service time? Do they go for the extra draft pick? And now I think we'll see with Gunnar that they'll do that. Grayson, I think, gives them that opportunity as well. Was added to their 40-man roster to protect from the Rule 5 draft. I think DL Hall is if he's in the top 100, he would qualify the same. So I think that they're going to be able to have you look at his last year's team, it was really young, and they were able to call up Adley, and they called up Gunnar, and he had Stowers but I think this is really the year you see that big wave, that big infusion of kind of the fruits of their efforts. You'll get a full year of Gunnar, a full year of Adley, possibly a full year of Grayson. Colton Cowser, who's another first round pick, could push for the majors at some point midseason. I just think there's a big collection of talent that is pushing and is going to join a team that last year was the best team in the American League, not make the playoffs.
Right. Knowing that, Nathan, they have a pretty wide open palette here in terms of what they could do in free agency. Do you see them going after a top of the rotation type of starter? For example, maybe like a Carlos Rodon or somebody like that, to try to give them that veteran presence that they seem to sort of be lacking on their pitching staff?
Yeah, if you look at, if you were to look at Fangraphs and look at roster resource right now and look at their projected rotation, I think their top starter is Kyle Bradish. And that's no offense to Kyle. He had a great second half, but he's going to be a second-year pitcher. Dean Kramer is a third-year pitcher. Austin Voth was a really rough reliever and had success after coming over on waivers. But there's just, like, to your point, there's a lot of question marks in that rotation. They've got a good group of guys, some guys who had stretches of success last season. But and then you throw in Grayson, who can be, hopefully develop into that type of starter. DL, who can potentially develop into that type of starter. But you look at it, there isn't a guy who you would say, yeah, that's their opening day starter. John Means isn't going to be back. He's still recovering from Tommy John surgery. So there isn't a clear top number one, guy who you would give the ball to on opening day, guy who you would give the ball to in the first game of a playoff series. And I think they need that. I think if they're serious about contending, then they need that. And whether it becomes through free agency or it comes through trade, I think that's the most obvious area that can make an addition and improve this team. Mike Elias said after the trade deadline, after he moved away a couple pieces without really getting anything back for the major league team, he said it's liftoff from here. And so I'm very curious to see what in actuality liftoff means. Obviously, when you're talking about a team that's, in the bottom 2 or 3 of major league payroll, it doesn't take too much to get off the ground from that point. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for them. There's a lot of room to grow. And so it just depends on how intense they want to be about it. But I think that there's an opportunity for them to definitely make a statement. And if they want to be a team that's contending for the AL East, there are moves to make that can make that a possibility.
Yeah, it seems they are on the right path here. I mean, they've got such an influx of talent coming here. I mean, do you think that they're looking at more like 2024 as the year to go all in, or do you hold open the possibility that they may make a move here before this season and like you said, make a statement?
Well, I think they're in win now mode. I think there's a desire to actually compete in 2023 that hasn't existed in prior off seasons. So I think that, they haven't signed a free agent to a multi-year deal under Mike Elias. And I think that's going to be required. They haven't traded for a, established major league player during his tenure. So I think those are two things that are going to have to change this offseason. They have set themselves up now to, they've promised an increase in payroll. They've said, like I said, it's liftoff from here. I think they've positioned themselves to now kind of have to. You're coming off a season where, again, best team in the American League by record and not make the postseason. You have a trade deadline where you aren't buyers or sellers. And so I think the fan base that has now sat through, the 4 rebuilding seasons, if you include 2018 in that, which isn't necessarily fair, but if you look at 2018 to 2021, 3 100-loss seasons, and the only exception was a 60-game season in total. So I just think that this team is in a position now where it can compete. It's in a division, obviously, that's really tough to win in. You've got the Yankees and Red Sox, who are always going to be good teams. Obviously, the Blue Jays had a couple years head start on them in terms of adding a wave of young talent, and the Rays are just kind of consistently good, consistently competitive, and kind of a model franchise for what the Orioles admittedly are trying to build. And so it's a tough situation to be in, but the Orioles obviously are going to have the opportunity. They showed what they could be last year without effectively trying to be a competitive team. And so now the opportunity is there if you're able to put a little effort in. I think there's just pressure on them in terms of what, a fan base is going to feel. But I think that, there's a responsibility on them, I think, to take that next step.
Mm-hmm.
Quickly,
Sure.
I wanted to follow up. You mentioned John Means coming back from Tommy John surgery. Do you have an estimate of when do you think we're going to see him back on the mound?
Yeah, I think I would know a little more in a week. That's definitely a question I'll be asking Michael Elias at the winter meetings coming up here, but nothing definitive. He is throwing, so obviously that's a good sign, but I would expect sometime June, July at the earliest. I think that would be a huge addition, obviously, to their rotation. That'd be, if you're able to make a, get a star basically the trade deadline, so to speak, I think that's a great opportunity for them. But in terms of what he's able to do, what he's able to provide, we'll see. You never know how guys are going to bounce back from this, but he's a guy who has meant a lot to this team over the course of the rebuild, and getting him back will be really significant for this team.
Absolutely. Nathan, could you talk a little bit about the outfield situation there too with Baltimore? I mean, obviously, most people around that follow know Cedric Mullins and have seen the two really good years that he's put together, but they also have some other interesting guys there like Austin Hayes and Anthony Santander. Do you see those guys being the starting three, or do you see other people kind of getting their foot in the door here? I'm thinking of Stowers, maybe Diaz Cameron getting an opportunity, kind of not a much ballyhooed signing there, but they brought him in as well with another guy who is a high draft pedigree, like you were talking about before with some of the infielders that they have. How do you see that outfield situation shaking out?
Yeah, I think as of right now, it's pretty easy to predict that it would be Hayes, Mullins, Santander. Obviously, I think Santander could get some time in the DH spot. You obviously want to leave that with some flexibility so you can put Rutschman there when you need to. I think Kyle Stowers is a guy who came up at the end of the year and really impressed. He didn't get a whole ton of opportunities early on after his initial call up, but once he was playing, when he did play, he was really impressive. Austin Hayes is a fascinating case to me because he was really, really good into late June, hit for the cycle, and then his season kind of fell apart. A couple of days after that, he made a dive in Chicago, hurt his wrist, and it seemed to affect him a little bit. But then the big issue was in talking with him was that he just had trouble rediscovering his full mechanics. He was out of balance. He was trying to just so he knew what the issue was. It's hard in the middle of the season to correct some of these things. So really struggled in the latter half of the season. I thought he was an interesting tender situation in terms of arbitration because his MLB trade rumors projection was a little over $3 million. And so I wondered, are the Orioles going to be willing to make that kind of investment for a guy who might not be a starting outfielder for them? But the fact they did, I think, speaks to them hoping to go into the season with him in a regular role. It is possible that develops into some kind of platoon. He is right-handed. Stowers is left-handed. There's some opportunities there. I think Ryan McKenna is a guy who is kind of the ideal fourth outfielder for them. Just what he does. The coaching staff's a big fan of him. They call him the Ferrari. Freddie Gonzalez, the bench coach, would go up to Brandon Hyde and be like, "Hey, I got the Ferrari in the garage for you," whenever they need a pinch runner or a defensive replacement. So he's a guy who I think brings a lot of value. I am interested to see how they view Daz Cameron. Obviously, just a waiver claim from Detroit, but a guy who Michael Elias drafted. He was the third pick from Houston in that draft where they got Alex Bregman and Kyle Tucker in the top 5. And then went to Detroit in the Justin Verlander deal. So obviously a player who, as you said, has some pedigree and, I obviously has some ties to Michael Elias. And that necessarily hasn't necessarily been, a boost for the players for whom that's been the case. They've had some other players who are connected to Michael Elias's Astros tenure here in Baltimore. I mean, Rio Ruiz got an extended run, but there have been some other guys who have come through who really haven't got much of an opportunity or didn't take advantage of their opportunity. So, I'm interested to see, obviously, being a waiver claim, he might be near the bottom of the 40-man roster. So who knows exactly how much of an extended opportunity he'll get this offseason to even make it to spring training necessarily. But obviously a guy the Orioles were intrigued by the tools. Michael Elias and, some other Orioles, leaders probably have some familiarity with him and believe that there's something they can tap into.
It's really interesting because like I keep saying, outside of where you're at, out here in the Midwest, there are a lot of people who think that Santander would be a trade candidate, and I don't see that being a possibility for that. Well, I shouldn't say not a possibility, but not likely that they would be looking to move the guy who's a middle of the order hitter at this time when they're developing that talent around him.
Yeah, switch hitter. I think he led all switch hitters in home runs. And he's a guy who, Brandon Hyde has kind of preached this during his tenure about the difficulty for a major league hitter to learn plate discipline at the major league level. You look at guys like Austin Hayes, like Ryan Mountcastle, like Santander. They came up to the majors. They didn't really focus on that during their climb of working the count and drawing walks. That wasn't a big part of their game. And Santander is the only one that, as they're now implementing these things and these efforts at the major league level, who really developed in that way. He saw a big boost this season in his walk rate. and really just became kind of a complete hitter. And so obviously you have some defensive question marks with him. He was a Gold Glove finalist a couple years ago, but it was in 2020 in the shortened season. So there are, I think, some questions. I think they would love to keep the DH spot open for him and have some flexibility there, but I also think they believe he can handle the job. He did work some at first base, so who knows how that kind of factors in. Maybe he and Mountcastle pair over there in some fashion. Never played in a game there, but it was just something he was kind of keeping in his back pocket. But he's a guy who, Mike Elias said at the GM meetings, told the MLB Network that, he's a guy that they see sticking around. But at the same time, and this applies to everyone in the organization, they listen. They do their due diligence. If someone calls and says, hey, we want Anthony Santander, like Mike Elias is going to take that phone call and hear what they have to say. But at the same time, he's not calling people and saying, hey, I have Anthony Santander, I'd love to give him to you. Right, so right. I think that he's an interesting piece for them. If you're able to have, two switch hitters in the middle of your order with him and Rutschman, I think that's a really nice combination. And we saw that this past season.
I want to ask you about Felix Bautista. Is he the for sure closer next season? I also want to ask you about his entrance music too. Do you have any insight into the origin of that or how that came about?
Yeah, in terms of the, what he provides in terms of save opportunities, I think he'll be the guy. Hard to see him, letting that go. Obviously, an interesting bullpen situation for the Orioles. We're going to last offseason. Going to last spring training, it wasn't really clear who their closer was going to be. And then Jorge Lopez got the job and just kind of ran with it. And then once he was traded, Felix was kind of the automatic, okay, well, we'll just bump that guy up then. And then in terms of that, I think it was something they had talked about where, they start off with the Omar whistle from The Wire, obviously a Baltimore-based show. And so I think that there was, some calling for that because with Lopez, they just like put fire on the video board. It was pretty plain. It wasn't necessarily anything specific, but then Felix gets the job. And I think it was like his third save opportunity. All of a sudden, that you hear the Omar whistle and then there's flashing lights going off and they have this orchestral music going and there's video of him striking out a ton of dudes. It's intense. It's cool to see them get into it and realize that, that there's fan engagement elements to that. People were super into it in terms of, just seeing the Orioles do something like that and having a player to do that for. I think it's hard when you look at what the Orioles have had to do in terms of player marketing. It's really hard to market players when you don't know if they'll actually stick around. Like Trey Mancini was one of the most marketable players in baseball, but you knew he was going to get traded at some point. So it's just like a really tough situation to deal with. And I think it's cool that now, you have a rookie closer who's going to be the closer again this next season. And, I assume that entrance might even get upticked a little bit, but it'll be back, I'm sure, in 2023. I just think it's just another sign, I think, of the excitement building in this organization.
Yeah, I mean, it is so cool just to watch it, on video. But I can't imagine like being in the park for that. It must be.
Well, the first time they did it, I was like taken aback. I was like, "What is going on? What is happening right now?" Because it was so unexpected.
That's awesome. So you talked a little bit before too, Nathan, about Jorge Mateo, and one of the things that I think a lot of fantasy players worry about with him is the hit tool. I mean, obviously we know that the speed is there. Do you see him making some adjustments? You're talking about how, system wide, the Orioles really work with these guys on making those adjustments and attacking weaknesses. What would you say his biggest weaknesses as a hitter and what he would be doing at this point this winter to try to make that a better skill for himself in the 2023 season?
Yeah, I know he had a lot of trouble with sliders down in the way. So I know that was a big focus with the Orioles hitting coaches is getting him to see that pitch. And there was a point, like I said, there was like a month or so where he really took off offensively and really seemed to be, a player who's playing that great defense, had that base running tool, and then had, a nice offensive package as well. And it just kind of faded off. So outside of that stretch, I don't think he was all that impressive. I think he hit just barely over 200. So there's definitely some concerns there. But I think if, especially when you look at what he could do in the stolen base category. When you talk about, a guy who stole, I think it was 30, 35 bases this past season. And now it's going to be even easier to steal bases, going to be shorter distance. I think, obviously that depends on him getting on base, but I think there's just a lot of value there in what he could do. Obviously I don't think he should be, maybe your top pick in that category, given that he's going to, even if he is going to be near the league leaders, there's going to be offensive guys who are going to do more offensively. But I think he should get regular playing time, at least as it stands right now. Obviously, the Orioles can make a couple trades or sign a couple guys and completely change their infield picture. But as it stands right now, I think he's a guy who's going to offer a lot in the stolen base category and then do enough in the other areas to maybe make an impact.
Yeah, it seems like Mateo and, we mentioned Gunnar Henderson and just in general, like the team may be, they were aggressive on the base pass and they may be more so this coming year with the rule changes. I'm wondering how much the dimensions at Camden Yards are going to play into that, or whether they played into that last year, just knowing that the fences were moved back, home runs were not as easy to come by. Just if you could tell me, Nathan, what was the teams, if you spoke to any of the hitters, like about this, what was their impression of the changes to the ballpark dimensions?
I mean, just a general like unhappiness about it for the most
Yeah,
part.
like I just wondered, was there like feedback, like
Right.
which
Well, so I mean, you look at a guy like I think Ryan Mountcastle is the best example of it as a right-handed power hitter. His kind of standard statement about it was it is what it is. He couldn't change anything about it. Trey Mancini, when he was in Baltimore, kind of exemplified the same thing. Those two guys ended up, I believe, if you look at StatCast, like the difference between actual home runs and expected home runs, though, like they were in the top 3 of difference between those two numbers, and so they got robbed by Baltimore quite a bit. And so, Ryan Mountcastle called it the Great Wall of China, but I don't think he considers it like a natural wonder of the world. So it's not a natural wonder. I don't think he considers it a wonder of the world. That's just to say that, they had a tough time with it. Like it obviously impacted numbers. If again, you look at some of the, deeper statistics with Mountcastle, his expected slugging percentage was really strong, but he again had the largest gap between expected slugging percentage and actual slugging percentage. So there's some bad luck here. I think some hitters are going to adjust. The Orioles are going to consider, I think, making adjustments, not so much in 2023, but beyond that, there's a lot of other things they want to do to that ballpark, assuming they stick around long term, which everything they have said indicates they will. And so I think that, at some point we will see other adjustments, not only maybe to left field, but other parts of the ballpark as they do other, fan-centric changes to the stadium. But I think in 2023, again, like that's when I think when you look at the Orioles' possible lineup, you look at Adley Rutschman's a switch hitter, Anthony Santander's a switch hitter, Gunnar Henderson's left-handed, Kyle Stowers is left-handed, Terrin Vavra's left-handed. You have a guy who's going to be pushing for major league time, and Colton Cowser is left-handed. So I think it's well timed for them in terms of what they have coming. I think it's obviously unfortunate for guys like Austin Hayes, or I didn't mention Cedric Mullins earlier as a left-handed hitter. But it's unfortunate for guys like Austin Hayes and Ryan Mountcastle, who, Ryan Mountcastle is going to be really dependent on home runs to be a successful major league hitter. And he's playing in a ballpark that is designed to take them away from him. So it's tough for him, tough for his game. But at the same time, like he said, it is what it is. They're going to have to deal with it. Opponents have to deal with it too. And it benefits their pitchers. And given what Orioles pitchers dealt with in 2019 through 21, all in all, it feels like a net neutral. If you dive into the numbers, it actually hurt the Orioles more than it hurt visitors. But that's a one-season example, and obviously over time, that's going to change.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, and you bring up Mountcastle. It's funny, like with all these really good young players coming up, I feel like at least in a fantasy perspective, I don't know about in Baltimore, but he's almost like a forgotten man, and he's like such a young player too. And I'm wondering, do you think, Nathan, is there another level to his game?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I just mentioned, his expected statistics are really good this past season. And he wasn't just having bad luck to left field. There were balls that he crushed to center that got, robbed at the wall or another ballpark. Like, I think he spent all of September, like, rounding for first base and then just staring out to the outfield in disbelief. Like, he was just like, how are these getting caught? Like, I think there's a clip, and I never confirmed with Ryan specifically, but it definitely looks like he just, like, stared out to center field. I think it was like Kike Hernandez robbed him a home run, and he just stared at the center field, and he just went, "I hate baseball." Is what it looked like he said, because he just was like on this, he was just crushing the ball, and all of them were getting caught. So I think that there's definitely another level to his game. He does have some issues with chase. He does have, a relatively meager walk rate. Like, there are areas to improve in his game. He's improved a ton defensively. So, like, to the Orioles, he brings a ton of value. But I think he's a guy who, I think there is another level. He's a young player. He's going to work on his swing decisions, again, and organizational philosophy. And if the luck starts to break his way again, if you see that his actual slugging percentage get closer to that expected slugging mark, you're going to have a really, really good player on your hands.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are going to be wrapping up in a minute here. Thank you so much for all of the information that you gave us. You told us a good story there about Ryan Mountcastle, but I wonder if we could get one more good story out of you during your time covering the team. Anything fun or interesting that you think our listeners would enjoy hearing about?
I remember back in 2019 in Anaheim, there was a game the Orioles played that went, I believe it was 16 innings. And so it started on July 25th, and then it was in Anaheim. So it started at 7 p.m. local time. So then it went past midnight because they didn't have the automatic runner on second rule yet. And my birthday is July 26th. So I literally turned 24 watching this baseball game that ended in Stevie Wilkerson, who was like a utility man, outfielder, second baseman, recording the first save by a position player in Major League history. And
I
so,
remember that. I do remember that.
my editor was like in Baltimore, and it was like 4 a.m. And I'm like, I have to write about history. Like, what are you talking? And it was my birthday, and it was like crazy. And it annoys me because everything you look at says that Stevie Wilkerson recorded that save on July 25th, but literally across the nation, it was July 26th. So that's what I have to say about that.
That's
So you and
wild.
Stevie Wilkerson are forever linked.
Yeah. One of the Orioles beat writers, whenever he wishes me happy birthday, he says happy birthday from me and Stevie Wilkerson. So
That's hilarious.
Well, we will leave it there. Again, Nathan, thank you so much. If you could please tell our listeners where they can find your work.
yeah, I tweet it all out at Nathan S. Ruiz. And if you want to get it from the source, you can go to baltimoresun.com or baltimoresun.com/sports/Orioles. I really appreciate you guys having me on.
Oh, you were
All right.
terrific. Thank you so much for being on with us. We've been following your work for a long time, and we're thrilled to have you on the show.
All
Thanks so much.
right. We are going to take a quick break.